Well, just like Marie told you, I come from the OECD, which is an organization settled in Paris, which gathers 35 countries and many partners. It's an international organization that provides evidence, advices, recommendation, but no money. So we are in principle famous to not be influenced by any normative or any conditionalities in the way we provide our information and advices. So 2 years ago, a little bit more, we began to work with the European Commission, the DG Regio for Cohesion Policy, just to underline the following thing that you perfectly perceived being here with us this morning, which is the following one. Once people will arrive, and at this time everybody was surprised, you know, with the flows of migrants arriving to EU borders and EU countries and EU cities. Whatever the thing that will happen, integration will happen soon, integration questions will be open soon, and to address them there is a need to adopt a territorial lens, because you do not integrate in space, you integrate it in places. So how does it work? This is the purpose of my presentation today, and I want to thank the Alliance for the opportunity to be with you this morning. Just one thing that I want to underline, and I will come back. You may be aware, but recently two big global compacts from the United Nations, a global compact on migration and another one on refugees, have been agreed. They will be officially adopted in December. These compacts are really a window for opportunities to local authorities to be better involved into this process, not just to implement decisions taken by others, but also to participate in the international decision making. So it's just an aside, and we will come back to that. So, how did we proceed? Usually in the OECD, we do not provide any recommendation or assessment without evidence. So the first step was to build evidence. What evidence is needed to argue, to defend the fact that there is a need for a territorial approach to migrant integration? The first one is to show if there is some kind of geographical heterogeneity in the way migrants are integrated, their outcomes, their presence. And so this is precisely what we did. And we have set a new database, statistical database on migrants in OECD regions. OECD regions means, for those who are familiar with the European jargon, means NUTS2. Half of Ireland is one TL2 NUTS2 region. In Ireland there are two big regions like that. And so for all these regions, more than 300 in the OECD, we were able to gather information about the presence of migrants, their level of education, the degree of unemployment, and their housing condition. So it was quite rich as an information, and also to be able to compare with native-born people. Just precision. We use a statistical database which is called the Labor Force Survey. And in the Labor Force Survey, we deal with people who have the right to work because they are registered in employment or unemployment type of statistics. So the only thing that characterizes them as migrant is the fact that they are foreign born. So of course it's really a very specific definition of migration, but it gives quite proxy. You can reach all these statistics on the OECD website, and there is also a data visualization tool. If you click on one region of your interest, you will have all the information. Statistics is a good thing, but it's not enough, because you do not see what policies are behind. What are the things that can explain the success or the failure of integration paths? And so we try to ask local authorities, what are they doing? And so to proceed to this inquiry, we prepared a questionnaire that was sent by two international associations of subnational government, the CEMR, which is the European branch of the International Association of Subnational Government, and the Eurocities, which mainly target large cities in Europe. They diffused, they shared this questionnaire with their members, and we were able to gather more than 70 responses. Among these responses, we were also inside boxes, if I may, in the black box of the machinery with 10 cities. It was based on voluntary basis. Who want to work with the OECD thanks to the EC support? And suddenly, very promptly, 10 cities declared their interest. Among them, 9 are large cities. You know, they are positioned here. We have Amsterdam, Athens, Berlin, Barcelona, Glasgow, Gothenburg, Paris, Rome, and Vienna. And one is a smaller one, which is Altena in Germany, in the North Rhine-Westphalia land. It's a very interesting case because the mayor has been very, very active to receive more refugees than the quota he was supposed to receive. Because his area suffers from depopulation, they have lost some public services like a hospital because they were not enough numerous. They have big companies in this area, and it's impossible for this company to hire people. So they consider, the mayor in particular, that making migrants camp could be a solution for the future of his own community. So creating a more diverse society, local society, would be a solution for the development of all. So it was an interesting case. We prepared those 10 case studies. They are here. There are 3 which are not yet published. Paris will be done next week, Rome the following days, and Glasgow we made some difficulties because, and it's really related to political issue, and you might be sensitive to that. When I worked, for example, on Barcelona wanted to have more migrants than the decision of the national government, because for them it's a political, I would say, fight. They want to show that they are a more welcome society than Spain in general, and they want more Catalans than Spain in general. So the central government refused us to publish a lot of things. So it was really a diplomatic work to align opinions. With Glasgow, we had a little bit the reverse. UK accepted the things we said. We benefited a lot from a variety of experience in Glasgow, very interesting one. But now they had the change in government in Glasgow and Scotland, and it's a little bit more difficult to validate the final version. We hope to achieve it. So the question provide. Sorry. To be brief, if you have just 2 things to keep in mind, then we will go into details. The first thing that we were able to show is that, of course, places matter. You cannot have just national or European policy for integration. It will be based on average, and average, they do not mean nothing. So what is important is to go where people are and maybe to better match where migrants come to increase the chances of successes of their integration process. Why places matter? Because we have observed a variety of differences in the way migrants are integrated according to the places, and mainly among metropolitan, I would say, and less urban regions. There are big differences in that sense, in that direction. The second important result is that, of course, as soon as you said, we need to opt for more diversified picture and action, it will mean that you will have much more stakeholders on board, and you need to coordinate with them, in particular with local authorities and local authorities with non-state partners, NGOs, as well as businesses, as well as the civil society for sure. And so this interaction, this multiple interaction, is precisely the mandate, in a sense, of governance. We called it multi-level governance. There is a need for coordination, and everywhere we went, it it was, an issue. How to make the guy working on education align with the things I will do for labor, and what is going to happen if I do something if the one in housing are not with us. So how to make all these things happen, not just at the national level, but at the local level and with neighbor communes. It's something which is it's a big challenge in integration. So the report that you have here, and I have not a lot, I have several case studies, but also everything is online and the flyers is available on the table. So we produced a report which gathered more than 80 practices organized into a system. And this is also the system that I will present to you. We called it a checklist for public action to migrant integration at the local level. It's quite simple. It's very concrete. We went in all these cities and we observed that there are the several objectives and action, they can be organized according to 12 priorities. And these 12 priorities, we provide tools to reach them and examples from the cities, how they have done it. So the presence of migrants, this map doesn't mean nothing it doesn't mean a lot, because it's a little bit old. These results are from 2014-15. And at this time, even in Ireland, the presence of migrants was so high that all Irish regions included in their population more than 15% of migrant origin population, which is a little bit lower now for what I know. You can see this diversity. In Australia, it's the same. In Canada, we do not have the information here, but it's quite high too. And in the US, it's quite distributed according to the US states. There are some countries we do not have the information, but you can observe that Sweden, Germany, they were also top in Europe already in 2014 and 15 to collect and integrate migrants. So in most countries, what have we observed? In most countries, the higher share of migrants, where do migrants go? They go where migrants are. So very typically, there is a kind of self-enforcing mechanism, gathering people in city, agglomerate people, but they over-agglomerate migrants in a sense. I will give you an example, which is the one of France. This one. This one island is here. So not a lot of not big difference between the two big regions in Ireland. But in France, for example, the French population, less than 20% of the French population is living in the Paris region, which is called Île-de-France. There is more than 40% of foreign-born population living in the same area. So the phenomenon of agglomeration is even stronger for migrants. They gather where they are, where generation of migrants are, their networks are. So if it is a spontaneous choice, they will go in metropolitan regions. What is important with metropole? Why do they go also? It's not just because their networks are here, but also because the perspective in terms of employment are higher. There is always a gap in terms of unemployment between native-born people and migrant people. Migrant people are always more unemployed than native-born people. However, the gap between unemployed native and unemployed migrants is less pronounced, less big in metropolitan regions. So it's not exactly the case in Ireland. In Ireland, the gap is really strong in rural areas. And in metropolitan areas close to Dublin, it's even a little bit more favorable for migrants than for native, which is quite an exception. Usually speaking, results are less good. So does it mean that these migrants in cities are well integrated? In practice, not. Because all the cities we worked with, they were really happy to show to us, look, all the things we are doing for migrants to be integrated and so on. And so we asked, but where are they located in the metropolitan area? And everywhere we have been able to observe some kind of more distressed places, concentration of migration with some poverty challenges, gathering, you know, all the signals, unemployment, low level of education, low level of health. And so this type of situation, this type of living condition, you can observe them in France, in Paris, sorry, in the northeast of Paris, what one day a newspaper, US newspapers called the no-go zone. And so the reason why the mayor of Paris launched a campaign, please go in this zone. So it was a kind of battle. In Berlin, for example, migrant and past generation of migrants gathered alongside the past wall, you know, this black part of the area of Berlin. So when you are a manager of the city like that, you have to address not just migrant integration in general, but to give a specific focus on these areas and give them the means to make integration possible. Another characteristic related to places, what we have observed, and it was a little bit counterintuitive, we always think that in industrial region it will be easier to find an employment. It worked like that in the past, and migrants, they came in big industrial areas. Nowadays, what we have observed is the more industrial, the more traditional industry is the specialization of a region, the more unemployment of migrant vis-à-vis native will be high. So in practice, those regions which face difficulties nowadays, the difficulties are much more perceived by the migrant community than by the native. So they are the first to be fired, or they are the first to find difficulties. So it's, again, an additional element that plead for having not an average policy, but a more, I would say, specific place-based policy. It's a little bit different with asylum seeker. Why? Because it's not spontaneous. In the great majority of cases, through formal or informal mechanism, European countries have adopted some kind of dispersal mechanism to redistribute asylum seekers and refugees sometimes in their different counties and cities. And so what we have observed is for asylum seeker, and it's just I would say one shot, an ad hoc picture, because nobody can tell, I cannot tell you that this image is still relevant 2 years after, because those people of course can move. And so what we have observed is that the distribution is quite evenly done in Sweden, much more different in Germany and in the UK. In Dublin, you see, in Ireland, you see a concentration in the Dublin area. And so there are this, and in Italy is quite, of course, there is a concentration in the south of Sicily, but it's also distributed across the different places. What is important is that through these mechanisms, a variety of local authorities who were not so much concerned with migrants, they became actors in this policy field. In the past, it was just an issue for, you know, the big city, diversity in places, segregation, blah, blah, blah. But with the distribution, the dispersal mechanisms, many subnational government, small and medium-sized commune, they suddenly became actors, active players in this field, some with enthusiasm, some less. And so we also have to deal with that. Just an aside, we have this picture for asylum seeker. Of course, asylum seeker, they are distributed and they wait for a permit to be decided for them to stay or not. And during this period of time, they have access or not to a variety of services and options. What is important is that some reforms took place recently. And for example, in Sweden nowadays, even refugees, the ones who have a permit, they are the purpose of a dispersal mechanism. With a permit, you are not considered to be as mobile as a Swedish people. You have to stay in a place you obtain the permit. And in Germany, some lenders also adopted this approach. making refugees stay at least 3 years in the place they have obtained their permit. There are some exceptions. If your spouse found a job in another place, if you find a job in another place, you can move. But in practice, it's very compulsory. So it's just, I want to tell you that because we observed all a kind of movement. Some places were really enthusiastic to help others at the moment of the big flows of refugees in 2015 and 16. And nowadays, we observe just the reverse. And migration has, became a little bit the proxy of some kind of populist positioning in policy. So it's something which is really, nothing is in stone. I don't know if it's the right wording. So, something which is quite important in terms of opinion. Sorry for this graph, but it's very easy to understand. We correlated, meaning that we tried to link the result we have observed in terms of presence of migrants and their outcomes in terms of employment with what we knew from the European Social Survey, which collect the opinion of European people vis-à-vis migration, positive or negative opinion. It's very simple. And what we have observed on the left side is a positive correlation which is associated with the diversity of the place. The more diverse, the more immigrants in an area, the more positive will be the view, the perception, the opinion vis-à-vis newcomers, okay? So if you are accustomed, in a sense, to diversity, to multiculturalism, you accept the other to join, okay? Which plead, in a sense, for metropoles to be ready to host. The metropolitan society are probably more ready to host the people. However, there is a second correlation, which this time is negative, which is the following one. If unemployment, native people unemployment is high, then the general opinion vis-à-vis migration will be less positive. So if your economic situation is not so positive, or if worse, if you anticipate that your situation or the one of your kids will be less good, you will be, of course, more resistant to newcomers to take the jobs that should be reserved for native people. We all know this type of languages. So these two things are quite important, because what do they mean? They mean that migration is just the mirror, is a revelator, in a sense, of the economic and social situation of a place. The more successful in terms of employment, the more successful in terms of social cohesion, the less difficult will be the integration. And so for me it's quite a strong result, because it means that if you have territorial development policy, if you have local economic and social development policy, they have to integrate migration, because it's the same thing. It's really important to keep this thing in mind. So another thing, let's abandon statistics now, and let's go into the qualitative aspects of the things we have observed. A very strong conclusion. As a policymaker, if you want to integrate people, you first have to integrate policies. So it is, the example I took earlier when I began the presentation. You need to have housing, job, education, social welfare, health, all together to respond to their needs. At the same time, you cannot create a subgroup of people, specific policies for specific population, creating some kind of policy, two types of policy, while all our society, in all countries I visited in Europe, we have this right-based access, the universal access to basic services. Everybody has to be treated the same way. But those people, they have to benefit, in a sense, from specific support, precisely to be able to reach these public services universal access. So one big challenge is the coordination one. And among these difficulties, we questioned, we asked to our sample, and something was important. Almost 90% of our responses consider that the biggest difficulty in terms of governance, more than money, is the gap, the lag in terms of information between national level and local level. They do not know to whom they have to ask an information. They do not know what will be the new regulation. They do not know if the guy that they have to host because they ask for asylum will have a chance or not to stay. They do not know how many they will have to receive. They do not know a variety of things. And so this gap in information makes the local policy making quite a challenge. Another one which has been ranked very high is the policy gap. If you want to provide a holistic, intersectoral type of policy, you have to make all your different departments to work together. And for large cities, a big challenge. If you go in Berlin, if you go in Vienna, there are huge governments, and making the different departments work together is it's rather difficult. It's not a difficulty for a smaller place. For example, in Altena, the social people in charge of one family, he can just ring the bell of his neighbor in the same, city hall and ask, hey guy, could you help me? Because this family, they need this thing or those things. So it's much more direct and easy. They face other type of challenge, but not the one of coordination. Financing is important, of course, but not the first concern, just a fourth one. And housing for migrants and refugees, of course, very, very challenging in large cities, less a challenge in rural areas. So it's so a challenge that, in a sense, the difficulty that large cities meet with housing for refugees, you can think about, and I think that it's quite present also in Dublin. When you have many students, when you have many visitors, the prices, they increase, the rent, they increase. It's much more difficult than in the past, even for native people to have a home inside city. So find a place for newcomers is even more difficult. And there are places like Barcelona, for example, they try to control the tourism activity just to preserve local people to have a chance to live in the city and not transforming it into a kind of museum. So these are important things, fighting for more integration in housing, fighting against segregation is a big challenge, and above all in large cities. However, you probably have noticed that even in smaller cities, very often, foreign people are gathered in some specific places. So for us, a good practice, and you will see that, is really to decentralize in the city the localization. 5 minutes? 5 minutes, so I will have to go quick. We gathered all these examples and provide the following blocks. 12 priorities organized into 4 blocks. The first one is think about who is doing what, with what means and what resources. Try to promote cross-sectoral activities and align, the financial resources with the local competences in terms of migrant integration. The second block is time and proximity. We all know that integration is not just a one-shot policy. So you have to provide some continuity in the process of integration. Once people obtain a status and they transform from asylum seeker to refugee, it doesn't mean that suddenly they can reach all services easily. It's not the case. They should benefit from some kind of continuity, probably less strong, less costly, but they have to benefit from this continuity. There is also a need for proximity to break this segregation and make more intercultural, social activities at the local level. And there are many examples. I may not have time, but we can have in the discussion. In terms of policy formulation and implementation, The public sector capacity and diversity has to be preserved. It's a big part of the strategy in Ireland, you know, diversity in civil servant, interaction between the different communities at the local level. I don't know to what extent it is implemented, but the ambition is high. Cooperation with non-state is quite a very important thing. Almost 90% of our cities declare that they work with NGOs to engage integration processes and evaluation. Without evaluation, you cannot share the good result with the local community. You cannot direct your policy making and understand what works or not. In terms of sectoral policy, jobs, housing, welfare, and education, what we have observed is very often local authorities are involved in policy areas for which they have no specific competence. These competences are not allocated to them. However, when someone is sleeping in the street and you are a mayor, you have to act. And so they engage an action, but they engage an action with partners. And those partners are very often businesses, housing corporation, NGOs, of course. So this is just an example of the institutional mapping. I show you Athens, but I can show you Amsterdam. You know, we promote for all local authorities to have to clarify who is in charge of what was the money, who set the standards, who evaluate the policies. And so I will not, this is an example, the Kids Orchestra in Glasgow, which is a way to make the different communities live together and share some activities, in particular in terms of music, in Govan Hill, which is a distressed area, center town, and the libraries, which are very often used as a place where different communities can meet and engage in shared activities. This is an image of a Barcelona one. As a municipality level, you have to engage in capacity building, in evaluation and cooperation with non-state. I can provide details if you want. But since I have to conclude, I go to the conclusion. You will have a lot of examples, and the slides will be reachable for all the things which have been engaged by all these cities. And let's go to the conclusion. What's next? What are the things that we will do with all this work? The first, I invite you to use this checklist to compare the activities of local authorities in your areas, in your counties, in your own city, and to use it also for a dialogue with national government. And in particular, the B point, this is a very powerful tool to make the different stakeholders share their experience and converge towards shared objectives. You have to work, and we have to work on indicators, and this is something that probably the European Commission will ask us to continue working on, but they are very focused on evaluation, economic impact of migration, you know. Well, economic impact means that you also have to benefit from social results, because if not, economic results are not sustainable. We need to work with small and medium-sized cities, of course, and it's also possible to integrate migrant integration as a topic in other policy topic. For example, in Finland, they are very, very interested in attracting talent. And so they want to have an integration policy, but they want to select migrants. So how to make when you attract talent, you attract everybody. So you have to think about the consequences of attractiveness policy. And I invite you to prepare the cohesion policy post-2020. Why? Because nowadays, migrant integration is one of the targets. So as a regional entity, you can obtain funding for a project if they target integration. So it's something that may change the perception and make an advantage from this investment. Sorry for the additional time. Thank you very much.